In late 1943, Japanese commanders believed they understood the rhythm of the Pacific War. Every island mattered. Every position had to be defended. Every American advance would arrive in the same grinding, predictable pattern: bombard, land, fight, repeat. They expected a long, brutal battle for every mile of coral, jungle, and volcanic rock. But then something changed. American forces suddenly began bypassing heavily fortified islands, leaving thousands of Japanese soldiers cut off, isolated, and waiting for attacks that never came. Airfields that had taken months to construct were abandoned overnight. Garrison troops, trained for face-to-face combat, found themselves stranded on islands that no longer held strategic value. The Japanese called this period mysterious. Historians would later call it something else: the Island Leap, the strategy that shattered Japan's defensive map of the Pacific. The panic did not begin with explosions or landings. It began with silence. One by one, entire Japanese garrisons realized that the Americans had simply skipped them. While American forces advanced rapidly toward the Philippines and the Marianas, Japanese troops on bypassed islands watched helplessly as supply lines collapsed, radio contact failed, and starvation replaced combat as their primary enemy. This is the real, documented account of the moment Japanese forces first understood the terrifying truth. The Americans no longer needed to defeat them in battle. They could simply leap past them, leaving them behind to wither, unseen and forgotten. What followed was confusion, fear, and the collapse of an entire defensive system that Japan had believed would last years. Before the Americans introduced the strategy that would unravel Japan's outer defenses, the Imperial Japanese Army operated under a clear, rigid assumption: every island mattered. From New Guinea to the Gilberts, from the Solomons to the Marshalls, Japanese planners believed the Pacific War would be decided through a slow series of grinding island battles, each one costing the enemy precious time, lives, and resources. The defensive map Japan created reflected this belief. It was not a loose chain of isolated outposts, but a web, interconnected, layered, and fortified where possible. Garrison troops manned bunkers, observation posts, airfields, and supply depots built across dozens of islands. Even small, seemingly insignificant coral atolls were transformed into defensive positions staffed with hundreds or thousands of soldiers. This network served multiple purposes: early warning, spotting Allied fleets before they approached major positions; logistical staging, enabling aircraft and ships to refuel and repair; regional control, preventing American forces from establishing stable footholds; psychological advantage, presenting an image of an unbroken defensive line stretching across the Pacific. Japanese commanders believed that the Americans, constrained by long supply lines and limited amphibious capability, would be forced to attack these islands one by one. Each island would buy Japan time to reinforce, time to reorganize, time to respond. This belief shaped everything: troop distribution, construction priorities, and even morale. Many soldiers stationed on remote islands understood their role clearly. They were the outer shield of the empire. Their presence alone was meant to slow the American advance and force costly confrontations. But the structure had weaknesses. Some islands lacked fresh water. Others were difficult to resupply. Many depended entirely on centralized shipping routes that were already at risk due to growing American submarine activity. Still, Japan accepted these risks, convinced that the Americans would not skip fortified positions for fear of leaving enemies at their backs. As 1943 progressed, Japan continued to strengthen its outer ring despite mounting logistical problems. Engineers carved airstrips out of coral. Soldiers built defensive tunnels under tropical heat. Garrison troops rehearsed night counterattacks against landings they assumed were inevitable. What they could not anticipate was a fundamental shift in American planning. By this stage of the war, U.S. intelligence, naval power, and industrial capacity had expanded dramatically. Admirals and generals began to rethink their approach, questioning whether it was necessary to assault every position sitting between their fleets and Japan's heartland. The cost of frontal assaults was high, and many islands offered little strategic value once surrounding waters and skies were controlled. This reevaluation marked the quiet beginning of a seismic change. Meanwhile, the Japanese defensive web remained based on older assumptions, that the Americans would follow conventional logic, that they would treat every island as essential, that the battlefront would creep slowly westward. But those assumptions would soon collapse. Within months, the Americans would adopt a strategy that treated the Pacific not as a line of stepping stones, but as a map of choices, some to attack, some to bypass, and many to leave behind entirely. And when the first islands were skipped, Japanese soldiers stationed there did not understand what it meant. Not at first. They only felt something strange, an absence. The absence of gunfire, the absence of fleets, the absence of battle where battle was expected. It was the beginning of a shift that would leave entire garrisons stranded in silence, realizing too late that the war had moved on without them. The first major test of America's new approach came in the Central Pacific, where Japanese forces occupied a long chain of islands, some heavily fortified, others barely developed. For months, U.S. commanders had studied the map, identified radio traffic, and assessed aerial reconnaissance. What emerged was a striking realization. Not every island needed to be taken. Some held no deep-water harbor, no operational airfield, no meaningful supply value. Many existed in isolation, dependent entirely on Japanese transport ships that were increasingly vulnerable to submarine attack. The Americans chose one of these low-value islands as the place to try something entirely new. A bypass, a leap. The island held several thousand Japanese troops. They had spent months preparing for a brutal defense, digging trenches, reinforcing bunkers, and positioning artillery to meet an assault they believed was inevitable. The soldiers expected bombardment, landing craft, and close quarters fighting in the dense undergrowth. Instead, they received nothing. American ships appeared briefly on the horizon, just long enough to confirm the garrison's presence. Then, without engaging, the fleet turned away, heading toward a different target dozens of miles away. For the Japanese defenders, the sight was baffling. They waited for the bombardment they knew must follow. They waited for landing craft. They waited for the roar of carrier aircraft diving overhead. Hours became days. Days became weeks. The Americans never returned. Unbeknownst to the garrison, the U.S. Navy had struck at a nearby island with a superior harbor and ideal terrain for airfield construction. Within days, American engineers were carving runways out of coral, preparing a base that would dominate the surrounding skies. The bypassed island, once deemed essential, was now strategically irrelevant. Japanese commanders initially refused to believe what had happened. Their defensive doctrine insisted that no major American advance could occur without engaging every fortified position along the route. Yet the Americans had done exactly that. They had leapt over one of their strongholds as if it did not exist. At first, Japanese officers viewed the strange silence as temporary. Perhaps the Americans were planning a larger assault. Perhaps they were probing for weakness. Perhaps they were regrouping. But then something unprecedented occurred. American bombers, flying from their newly constructed airfields, began targeting the waters around the bypassed island. Not to prepare for invasion, but to sever supply lines. Convoys attempting to deliver food, ammunition, and medicine were intercepted and destroyed. Messages sent by the stranded garrison to regional headquarters went unanswered. Radio operators monitored static for hours, hearing nothing but the faint hum of distant patrols and the whisper of an ocean that now felt impossibly large. For the Japanese soldiers trapped on that island, the realization came slowly, painfully, and with growing alarm. The Americans were not coming because they did not need to. The island had been removed from the war. The panic that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet. Anxiety spreading through men suddenly cut off from the empire they were sworn to defend. They were still armed, still trained, still loyal, but they were no longer relevant to the battle unfolding beyond the horizon. And as the days passed, the weight of that truth would begin to break down an entire defensive strategy built on the assumption that the Americans had to fight for every island. They didn't, and the Japanese forces, stranded with no battle to fight, understood that the war had changed in a way their commanders had never anticipated. In the weeks that followed the first American bypass, the psychological impact on the stranded Japanese garrison became impossible to ignore. These men had been trained for assault landings, night counterattacks, and close-quarters defense of fortified positions. They expected bloodshed, bombardment, and a final stand worthy of imperial military tradition. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see, silence, isolation, and the slow collapse of everything their defensive doctrine was built upon. At first, the troops remained disciplined. They continued daily drills. They monitored the coastline. They rationed supplies according to regulations. But all of these routines were built on the belief that a battle was coming. And when the days accumulated without a single American landing craft on the horizon, uncertainty began to fracture the confidence that had once held the garrison together. For many soldiers, the earliest sign of trouble was the supply situation. Japanese logistics in the Pacific had always been strained, but the bypass created a new, unprecedented problem. Supply ships stopped coming entirely. American aircraft now patrolled the surrounding waters, turning any attempt at resupply into a suicidal risk. The garrison watched helplessly as the ocean, their only lifeline, became an American-controlled barrier. Rice stocks dwindled. Ammunition remained locked away and used. Medical supplies ran dangerously low. Water, if not collected carefully, posed a real threat of disease. What alarmed the soldiers most was that no effort seemed to be made to reach them. They sent encrypted messages to regional command, first requests for updates, then urgent appeals for supply, then simple confirmations that they still existed. Most messages went unanswered. The ones that did receive replies were vague, suggesting strategic realignments or encouraging the garrison to hold its ground. But without concrete directives or logistical support, these messages only deepened the confusion. The soldiers realized they were no longer part of a cohesive defensive line. They had become isolated dots on a map, important only in theory, but irrelevant in the new reality of the Pacific War. As supplies shrank and isolation tightened, discipline began to erode, not through rebellion or insubordination, but through fear. Some soldiers reported phantom movements in the jungle at night, mistaking wildlife for American patrols. Others believed that an invasion was imminent despite all evidence to the contrary. Rumors circulated that nearby islands had fallen, that the Imperial Navy had withdrawn, that the garrison had been forgotten entirely. The psychological shift was profound. Japanese doctrine emphasized honor in battle, but provided little guidance for soldiers left with no enemy to fight. Many felt trapped, armed, trained, and prepared for sacrifice, yet unable to fulfill their duty. The idea of being skipped, bypassed, or ignored contradicted the deeply held belief that every soldier in the defensive web held a meaningful position. As time wore on, hunger replaced panic as the primary threat. Men grew thinner, weaker, and increasingly ill. For some, the realization that they might die without ever seeing combat, without ever firing a shot in defense of their posts, was harder to bear than the starvation itself. Small groups attempted foraging expeditions into the interior of the island, but the jungle offered limited sustenance. A few soldiers began collecting seawater to evaporate salt, while others fashioned traps to catch crabs or birds. These measures delayed the inevitable, but they were not enough to sustain a garrison of thousands. The bypass strategy had turned a fortified island into a prison, one where the bars were starvation, isolation, and silence. And across dozens of islands throughout the Pacific, similar scenes were beginning to unfold. The defensive web Japan had spent years constructing was unraveling not through battle, but through neglect. By skipping these islands, the Americans had removed entire garrisons from the war without firing a single shot. And for the men trapped on those islands, the slow realization of this truth was more devastating than any bombardment could have been. As months passed, the Japanese soldiers stranded on bypassed islands entered a phase of isolation unlike anything they had been trained to endure. Their doctrine, built on sacrifice, defense, and the expectation of a glorious final battle, had not prepared them for abandonment. The empire they served had stretched too far, its supply routes broken, its naval strength diminished. And now, entire garrisons were discovering that they no longer existed on Japan's strategic map. Communication slowly faded. The powerful radio transmitters that once linked the island to regional command fell silent more often. Batteries weakened. Spare parts ran out. What messages did get through lacked clarity? Some hinted at shifting battle lines. Others referenced new fronts in the Philippines or the Marianas. None addressed the stranded garrison's worsening situation. The soldiers felt the disconnection first as uncertainty, then as dread. For decades, imperial doctrine had emphasized unity, discipline, and loyalty to the state. Soldiers believed they were part of a larger whole, an unbreakable defensive chain stretching across the Pacific. The bypass strategy shattered this belief in a way that direct defeat never could. The Americans no longer saw them as obstacles. They were irrelevant. Terrain once believed vital was now simply marked by silence. Airfields carved from coral and jungle no longer served a purpose. Artillery dug into hillsides never fired a significant shot. Months of labor had been rendered meaningless with a single decision made far beyond the horizon. As hunger deepened, survival replaced discipline as the soldiers' primary concern. Many Japanese garrisons depended on monthly resupply. Without it, the beaches became graveyards of shattered crates washed ashore from wrecked transports. Soldiers sifted through debris, recovering anything edible. Rice grains swollen with seawater, rusted cans, or mold-covered biscuits. Water shortages became critical. Some garrisons dug shallow wells, only to find them tainted with bacteria. Others rationed rainwater collected in barrels or cut down palms searching for moisture. Diseases that had once been manageable, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, spread unchecked. Yet despite these hardships, the soldiers struggled to maintain a sense of military order. They continued raising the imperial flag. They patrolled abandoned airstrips. They cleaned rifles they no longer had ammunition for. These routines were not acts of denial, but attempts to preserve meaning in a war that had passed them by. What haunted the garrisons most was uncertainty. They had no clear sense of Japan's broader situation. Rumors filled the void left by silence. Some believed reinforcements were coming. Others thought the empire was regrouping for a decisive counterattack. A few even speculated that the Americans had suffered a catastrophic defeat elsewhere and would soon return. But the evidence told another story. The distant roar of American bombers, the glow of naval battles beyond the horizon, and the increasing absence of Japanese ships in surrounding waters. For many soldiers, the realization came gradually. They were no longer defenders of an empire. They were survivors of a forgotten outpost. By late 1944, entire Japanese garrisons scattered across the Pacific remained on islands the Americans had chosen to skip. Cut off from supplies and command, their existence faded into obscurity, seen only when American reconnaissance flights passed overhead or when small skirmishes erupted with isolated patrols. The bypass strategy had severed more than supply lines. It had cut the emotional and psychological connection between the soldier and the state. And for men raised to believe in the unbroken unity of the Japanese defensive web, the sense of abandonment was devastating. By the final year of the Pacific War, the consequences of the bypass strategy, quiet at first, almost invisible in the grand movements of fleets and armies, had fully taken hold across dozens of Japanese garrisons. These outposts, once considered vital links in a defensive chain stretching thousands of miles, had become silent pockets of isolation. No battles raged there. No American landings stormed their beaches. Instead, the collapse came slowly, driven by hunger, disease, and the erosion of purpose. Life on these bypassed islands settled into a grim routine. Soldiers awoke each day weaker than the last, their bodies thinned by months of malnutrition. The absence of fresh food forced them to rely on whatever they could gather from the jungle or the sea. Some units learned to trap small animals, others boiled roots or scraped edible growth from trees. Fish became a lifeline when they could be caught, but the reef offered only so much, and competition for food grew fiercer over time. For many men, the hardest challenge was not physical, but psychological. Their training had prepared them to endure suffering, but always in the context of combat, sacrifice for a decisive purpose. Yet here, there was no enemy to fight, no objective to achieve, no clear understanding of how their suffering contributed to the empire's survival. They existed in a suspended state, still soldiers, still armed, but increasingly disconnected from the war's unfolding reality. Occasionally, distant echoes reminded them that the conflict still raged elsewhere. At night, they saw flashes on the horizon, faint signatures of naval engagements hundreds of miles away. American bombers sometimes passed overhead, bound for more important targets. But no attack came for the garrison itself. The Americans had already achieved their aim simply by ignoring them. This quiet neglect created an atmosphere of dread unlike any battlefield. There was no moment of clarity, no final stand, no heroic last defense. Instead, the garrisons dissolved slowly, first in morale, then in health, and finally in numbers. Patrol logs recorded fewer men returning from foraging missions. Medical ledgers showed rising deaths from infection and malnutrition. Many soldiers succumbed to illnesses once considered manageable, but now impossible to treat without supplies. As time passed, even the officers found it difficult to maintain coherence. With communication severed, they could only guess at Japan's larger situation. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the empire was preparing a massive counteroffensive. Others insisted that surrender was imminent. A few believed the Americans would eventually return to finish what they started. The truth was unknowable. In some garrisons, small groups attempted to build rafts or boats from scrap wood, hoping to reach nearby islands rumored to still be connected to the war effort. Most of these attempts ended in tragedy. Rafts overturned by surf, men lost to currents, or expeditions disappearing without a trace. The vastness of the Pacific made escape a near impossibility. By mid-1945, the quiet collapse of these isolated forces was complete. The once orderly Japanese defensive network had been hollowed out not through combat, but through irrelevance. Entire battalions that had been prepared for fierce resistance simply ceased to function. Their weapons remained stored, their fortifications intact, but the men who were supposed to defend them were now exhausted survivors struggling to stay alive. When news of Japan's eventual surrender finally reached these islands, often months after the war had officially ended, the surviving soldiers faced a truth that had been building since the first bypassed island was skipped. They had not been defeated in battle. They had been abandoned by the very logic of the war. The island leap strategy had undone Japan's defensive system not with overwhelming force, but with a single strategic insight, that not every island needed to be taken. And for the men left behind, this quiet collapse was the most devastating outcome of all. In the end, the effectiveness of the island leap strategy was not measured by the number of battles fought, but by the number of battles avoided. It reshaped the Pacific War in a way that Japanese commanders had never anticipated, transforming entire fortified positions into strategic ghosts. These islands, once essential nodes in Japan's defensive web, were bypassed, isolated, and left to fade into irrelevance. Their garrisons became silent witnesses to a new kind of warfare, one in which the enemy did not need to defeat them to neutralize them. For the Japanese soldiers left behind, the realization came slowly. Their weapons remained ready. Their fortifications remained intact. Their training remained sharp. Yet none of it mattered. The Americans had simply chosen not to fight them. What Japan viewed as indispensable terrain, the United States viewed as expendable. What Japan fortified to slow the war, the Americans leapt over to accelerate it. The psychological impact of that decision was profound. Never before had entire Japanese units been removed from the war without a single engagement. Never before had garrisons, some numbering thousands, been reduced to isolated pockets with no strategic purpose, no logistical support, and no understanding of how quickly the conflict was moving beyond their reach. For American planners, the success of the island leap strategy demonstrated a new approach. Control the air, control the sea, and the islands themselves lose their value. For Japanese forces, the strategy exposed critical vulnerabilities, overextension, supply fragility, and an inflexible doctrine that assumed the enemy would fight where expected. By the war's final year, dozens of Japanese garrisons scattered across the Pacific were living reminders of this strategic shift. Many survived on dwindling resources, unaware that the broader conflict was approaching its conclusion. Some fought small, sporadic skirmishes. Others dissolved through hunger and disease. And a few, astonishingly, would not learn the war had ended until years later. The island leap strategy did not rely on overwhelming firepower. It relied on movement, speed, and selective engagement. It turned Japan's sprawling defensive web into isolated fragments, each cut off not by battle, but by choice. For the men stranded on those bypassed islands, the Pacific War became a war of silence. And that silence, more than any bombardment, marked the collapse of Japan's outer defense. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.